is China on the rise to being the last world empire. With the largest ethnic group in the world and with the second largest economy, there are many people who believe that she's going to rise up and overtake the United States of America. If so, we shall find out in this study.
We have sectarian differences in the world right now. We have wars, we have religious upheavals, we have terrorism. Does the United States and China need each other more now?
We are at a moment when there's worldwide violence and there are upheavals in many parts of the world, and the economies of various parts of the world are closely related. But the joint economy of China and the United States probably represent close to half of the entire world economy. So we need each other, and we need to develop concepts and policies by which we can proceed on parallel roads.
The 21st century has witnessed a deep fear in the West with the rapid rise of the largest ethnic group on the earth, the Han Chinese. They are a race of people with a deep-rooted history that is unchanged, going back many millennia, with one of the deepest-rooted patriotisms than any other people. China is carefully being monitored by the West, for it not only has the world's second largest economy, it is penetrating to nearly every region on the globe for economic interests. Forbes magazine did a survey in 2015 on the richest corporations on earth, and China led the world with the top 4 of the world's richest companies. Though it is a nation in the East, throughout most of the 20th and 21st century, it has been dominated by an ideology from the West, such as communism from Marxism that came from Karl Marx. But now it is slowly entering into capitalism, where a number of elites has turned it into a country with the leading billionaires now surpassing the United States, with billionaire companies like Alibaba gaining more revenue than even eBay. And this has now made China on par or on an equal plane with the countries of the West. This has made many people believe that China is on a course of overtaking the United States as the world's #1 superpower. It was a country that under communist rule was deeply oppressive to religion, but now Christianity, that is greatly dwindling in the West, whose leaders are not even standing for the word of God in the public, is on the rapid rise in China that many believe will become the most Christian nation within 15 years, which is a triumph for the gospel. But every nation has its cracks. China has the highest number of diabetics on the planet. With an increase of many becoming rich, it has made a once very healthy nation very unhealthy, with a major increase in obesity, where many of its males from young to middle age just look round, and this will increase heart disease. Like most nations, it doesn't discuss sexuality, and was shocked to discover that there is a huge increase in HIV that makes up 92% of all new infections. So to reform the nation, the government is clamping down on nude art, has banned half-naked models from car shows, and banned cleavages at the video game show cosplay. In 2006, China was the largest revenue of pornography than any other country on earth. So the government has barred all internet pornography, but has gone so extreme that it's clamping down on all internet use, making it the most suppressive nation for internet freedom. Human Rights Watch called it one of the most authoritarian states on earth that hinders any opposition to the ruling elite. Their rulership in Tibet has led to repression, shootings, torture and sterilization of women, where Tibetan monks set themselves alight in protests. But this hasn't stopped the tech companies in the United States from doing business with it. While they are enemies on the surface, the Chinese military gets technological advice from IBM, Microsoft, Intel, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, and does business with both Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. China says it has a growing concern with a Turco-Mongol ethnic group called the Uyghurs, who are predominantly Muslim. With this so-called domestic threat, and even though it has to watch its back, it has aligned itself with the United States as an ally in this so-called global war on terror. So, is China a threat? The whole reason the Two Kingdoms study series was put together was to dispute people's belief that China is a growing menace. And in this study, we will look at the war on terror, slavery and its influence on the rise of the global economy, and the banks, and how these banks will eventually be used to manipulate the entire world, where they will eventually make the entire planet yield by force to the papacy. As Even at the Doors always instructs, please research everything that you see in this study. I will now present my thesis.
Great Scott!
Back to the Future.
Well, we're going, we don't need road.
What would you do if you had the opportunity of experiencing time travel, where you could go back into the past and observe historical figures or even great wars that determine and has shaped the future? What would you say to Napoleon or Nimrod or Hitler? Would you correct them? What if you could enter into a Stargate and go back into ancient Egypt to see how they built the pyramids? Well, you can go back into the past, or you can see into the future, and that is by a method that takes quite a bit of studying both history, current affairs, and the Bible. It is called prophecy. If you walk into one of the Babylonian rooms in the British Museum, there is a very interesting artifact that can be held in the palm of your hand, dated to the 7th to the 6th century BC. It is the account of a Near Eastern king called Nebuchadnezzar, and it records his invasion of Jerusalem that confirmed the historical accuracy of Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, the most attacked book in the Bible. Using the principle of repeat and enlarge, it prophesies the rise and fall of 4 earthly world empires that will be replaced by a 5th eternal one. The first kingdom mentioned in the book of Daniel was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, that was symbolized as a head of gold and also a lion with eagle's wings. Babylon was succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire in modern-day Iran, Western Asia, the largest empire of ancient history that integrated various civilizations and cultures within its empire, that is symbolized as the breast and arms of silver, the bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, and the ram with 2 horns. But the balance of power started to shift, and the nations of the East, who controlled and held sway for many millennia, were now to be overthrown and replaced by the armies of Alexander the Great in the West, who is symbolized as the belly and thighs of brass, the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, and the he-goat who came from the West. And it explains that the rough goat is the king of Grecia or Greece, who is Alexander the Great. So the last earthly powers come from the West. And any student of prophecy looking at China or Islam in the East is coming out of sync with the laws of prophetic interpretation. Greece was succeeded by Rome. This empire was officially founded by Julius Caesar, who created a republic where it passed on to his stepson Augustus Caesar. This empire is symbolized as the legs and feet in Daniel 2, and the 4th nondescript beast in Daniel chapter 7 with 10 horns, and the 11th or little horn that comes out of the 10 in Daniel 7, showing the transition from pagan to papal Rome. But in Daniel chapter 8, the little horn's description is described as both pagan and papal Rome, and it is also described in Daniel chapter 11 as the king of the north. And when you carefully compare the wording of the little horn and the same wording of the king of the north in the book of Daniel, they are one and the same power. Is the papacy the last power described in the book of Daniel? To be fair to Rome, as shown twice in 2 previous studies, we will let her own words verify what the prophet Daniel foresaw.
The Vatican is the last absolute monarchy in the world today. The Pope, when he is elected, is answerable to no human power.
In the 19th century, the Swiss-French Protestant Francois Samuel Louis Gaussen on the left and Scottish Protestant James Aiken Wiley on the right were the last breed of prophetic scholars who identified the papacy as the Antichrist, the man of sin, and the little horn of the book of Daniel. The 13th century Roman Catholic German Archbishop Eberhard II of Salzburg in 1240 is one of the first on record who identified the papacy as the Antichrist, the man of sin, and Daniel's little horn. The following century, John Wycliffe, the 14th century Oxford professor, known as the Evangelical Doctor and the Morning Star of the Reformation, in his deep Bible studies also identified the papacy as the Antichrist and the little horn of Daniel. And very few people are aware that one of the main reasons half of Northern Europe separated from papal control was because of people's understanding of Bible prophecy and justification by faith. In Germany you had Martin Luther and his protege Philip Melanchthon. In France you had John Calvin, who has influenced most of the English-speaking churches. His student Theodore Beza went to Holland and taught Jacob Arminius, the father of Arminianism. Another French reformer, William Farel, was a Lutheran who fled to Switzerland, and his fruit produced Ulrich Zwingli and his successor Heinrich Bullinger, one of the most influential theologians. Scottish martyrs George Wishart on the left and Patrick Hamilton on the right inspired the thundering Scot John Knox, a man who catapulted the Reformation in Scotland as a result of his identifying the last power, the papacy, as Daniel's little horn. In the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece is a sickle cell-shaped island called Patmos. The last book of the Bible, an extension of the book of Daniel called the Apocalypse, better known as Revelation, was written there, as the author confirms. It uses the biblical symbolism from the book of Daniel, where a king or kingdom is symbolically described as a beast. Prophetic scholars identify the papacy as a last power that had 7 heads, 10 horns, and the name or names of blasphemy, where eventually the entire world will give her complete homage and allegiance to her. In the 1600s, Thomas Goodwin, an East Anglican-born, Cambridge-educated Puritan who was a Calvinist and the president of Magdalen College at the University of Oxford, described the papacy as the last world power. He said now the description of Antichrist, the Pope, and his false church in his rise, power, greatness, and extent of his dominions, and of the company that should cleave to him, is set forth in the visions of the 13th chapter, which afterwards in the 17th chapter the Holy Ghost himself interprets and makes a comment on. The Pope, together with the body of these 10 kingdoms joining into one, whereof he becomes the head, is that first beast with 10 horns described in this 13th chapter. In the following century, in the 1700s, John Wesley, who was an English reformer, an Anglican minister, theologian, and founder of the Methodists, came to the same conclusion. Unlike Goodwin, who was a Calvinist, John Wesley was an Arminian. His plaque lies in the grounds of the Museum of London, and he was a true reformer who not only preached, but also was a sort of health reformer, looking out for diseases. Unlike the 1700 Franciscan and Inquisitor who tortured American Indians, who Pope Francis I has turned into a saint, and the Native Americans desecrated his monument in protest, and the British Field Marshal Jeffrey Amherst, who gave the Native Americans smallpox in a blanket, Wesley preached to them the true gospel, and he was also a strong opponent of the slavery of blacks, condemning it wholeheartedly. That was rare among most so-called reformers. In his notes on the New Testament, he said that out of the sea, that is Europe, in other words, he got the geography right, the beast is the Romish papacy. To this and no other power on earth agrees the whole text, and every part of it in every point. The beast has a strong connection with the city of Rome. This clearly appears from the 17th chapter. In the following century, in the 1800s in North America, John Nevis Andrews, a Seventh-day Adventist missionary, and like John Wesley, an Arminian in theology and a strong opponent of slavery, came to the same conclusion. He said that the beast with 10 horns by Daniel is also seen by John to ascend out of the sea. In him were blended the marks of all the preceding beasts: the body of the leopard, the feet of the bear, and the mouth of the lion. Daniel 7 verses 4 to 6. Revelation 17 represents the Babylon by the symbol of a woman seated on a scarlet-colored beast. The beast represents the fourth empire of our earth in its papal form. So through these succeeding centuries, these historicists identify the papacy as the last kingdom in both Revelation chapter 13 and 17. But interestingly enough, another kingdom is mentioned. It is described as a beast with 2 horns and the false prophet that performed miracles, exact same description. But her only real role on the prophetic map is to strengthen the first beast, the papacy, and her real role is still yet future if you read Revelation chapter 13 verses 11 till the end. Thomas Goodwin didn't identify who the Second Kingdom was, but he did hint that it would be a Protestant power that will eventually model itself after the papacy. He said that some receive his mark or character, others his name only, others the number of his name. And as in worship, so in doctrine, thus truly setting up an image of old popery in a Protestant reformed way, even as popery is an image of heathen worship in a Christian way. In the following century, John Wesley gave his analysis of who he thought was the Second Kingdom. He said that, and I saw another wild beast. So he is once termed to show his fierceness and strength, that in all other places the false prophet. He comes to confirm the kingdom of the first beast, but he gets the geography wrong. He says out of the earth, out of Asia. Now the last powers are in the west, not in the east. But he is not yet come, though he cannot be afar off, for he is to appear at the end of the 42 months of the first beast. And he had 2 horns like a lamb, a mild, innocent appearance. John Wesley connected all the dots right except the geography of the Second Kingdom. The last powers are in the west, not in the east. But he knew the Second Kingdom was to rise up in his time period in the 1700s. The papacy was temporarily overthrown by France under Napoleon Bonaparte, and Pope Pius VI was captured where he died in France. And the first kingdom received a deadly wound and was led into captivity, as Revelation chapter 13 verse 10 confirms, before the rise of the Second Kingdom in verse 11. So John Nevis Andrews in 1851 built upon the foundation of Thomas Goodwin in identifying it as a Protestant power, built upon the foundation of John Wesley by identifying the Second Kingdom as the beast with 2 horns and the false prophet, and this is who he said it was. The 2-horned beast is another beast besides the 10-horned beast. Hence it is certain that the location of the 2-horned beast is not in the 10 kingdoms of the 4th beast. The only civil government that has ever existed exhibiting the lamb-like appearance of this symbol is the United States. But the 2-horned beast or false prophet acts as an accomplice of the papacy in Satan's great work of final deception and unites in the great conflict against the King of Kings. Revelation chapter 19. Was John Nevis Andrews accurate in his prophetic forecast in identifying the 2 kingdoms as the papacy and the United States? Even at the doors has searched through the writings of Sir Isaac Newton and his observations upon the prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse, Matthew Henry and his Bible commentary, Philip Doddridge's exposition on the New Testament, Bishop Thomas Newton's dissertations upon the prophecies, Albert Barnes' notes upon the New Testament, Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness and his prophetic insights. But John Nevis Andrews is the only one who is accurate, and if he is on point, it must be put to the test. So let's see. The architecture of Rome in the Vatican, from St. Peter's Basilica and the obelisk, is modelled in the United States. The Pantheon of Rome and its 8 pillars is copied in the Jeffersonian Memorial. The Villa Farnese is Renaissance architecture that was built in the 16th century on the request of Pope Paul III, and it is a pentagon. The headquarters of the US Department of Defense, the Pentagon, is modelled after that building in Italy. And what does the Pentagon plan to do? Dr. Aurelio Picchi was an Italian scholar and industrialist who founded and became the first president of the think tank called the Club of Rome. In 1974, they produced a book titled Mankind at the Turning Point, and on page 38 they have divided the world into 10 regions, some say 10 kingdoms. On the official website of the Department of Defense, the Pentagon has combatant or command centers and air bases that covers these 10 regions, and successive US presidents have regular meetings with the heads of these command centers. With the United States surveillance in the planet with her drones, from big ones to small ones, what is her real overall objective? Let us see.
The global war on terrorism constitute the ideological underpinnings of global warfare. And of course it's based on deceit. And it's based on what we might call an inquisitorial doctrine, which is in some regards similar to the Spanish and French Inquisition of the Middle Age period, where you identify the heretics and then you go after them. Well, we have a little bit this concept of saying these are evil people, we go after the evil people and so on, and we use this as a pretext for ultimately killing millions of people. And that is the historic legacy of the United States of America.
The Canadian economist Michel Chossudovsky, who is a professor of economics at the University of Ottawa, is one of the very few who have analysed that the United States global war on terror is a revival of the Spanish Inquisition. And if it truly qualifies as the Second Kingdom, her warlike nature that is training minds via her films and video games is conditioning and preparing them for what she is going to accomplish on the prophetic calendar in the not too distant future, where it says that she will use all of her global and economic influence and her military might to make the entire world worship the first kingdom, the papacy. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. The papacy does not like anyone knowing and identifying who she is, and what her true plans are, and has ways and means of covering her tracks. The London newspaper The Independent records that any reporter who has covered the Vatican knows how efficient they can be in burying bad news. Even at the Doors has had a second video blocked that exposed the papacy, The Two Kingdoms Intro Part 1, where YouTube said that copyrighted material was used, where 3 media companies were cited as using their material. All of them are video imagery that looks at the papacy's role in world affairs, and this is the reality and the nature of the work. The Vatican in World Politics was published in 1947 and became a world bestseller. This book, Catholic Power Today, by the same author, goes into the struggle it took to publish it. Avram Manhattan's mentor, H.G. Wells, encouraged the book to be written, and he himself wrote a book titled Crux Ansata on the papacy, and half a dozen publishers rejected it until it was eventually published. When Avram Manhattan wanted to publish the Vatican in World Politics, 18 publishers in the United States and 39 in England were too scared to publish it. Why? Avram Manhattan described the invisible Catholic pressure, where he said that, as in the case of H.G. Wells, what made most of the British and American publishers shy of the manuscript was the threatening presence of the Catholic Church. And even more recently, Italian journalist Gianluigi Nuzzi is one of two journalists who have come into conflict with the papacy by exposing her where free speech and press freedom are now coming under severe attacks in Italy, especially for challenging the papacy. But the Vatican has been working on a very clever trick up her sleeve to break down the Church's resistance and identifying her as the last power in those prophetic books. It is called ecumenism, and the Council on Foreign Relations magazine Foreign Affairs has documented that the last Pope, Benedict XVI, has been the most successful of this papal strategy. It records that Benedict did more during his 8-year reign to overcome the Great Schism of 1054 and the Protestant Reformation, and to promote interfaith dialogue than any of his predecessors, including Pope John Paul II. He healed that rift from 1054, the oldest geopolitical diplomatic conflict in history, and his successor, Pope Francis I, is now continuing the work, where even the Coptic Church of Egypt is also strengthening relations with Rome. The Salvation Army is a very good charitable organization, but it is now wandering after the papal beast, strengthening ties that never existed before. And on the official website of the Grand Orient Lodge of England, the Salvation Army is a branch of Freemasonry. The Waldenses were once one of the most devoted and faithful missionaries in Christendom, and from the Middle Ages even up until the 19th century, they were hunted down, persecuted, skinned alive, burnt alive, fed to dogs, and butchered by the Catholic Church, who the Waldenses identified as the Antichrist and the Whore of Babylon. But now they have forgotten their history, put down their guard, and have reconciled with Rome. The German Augustinian monk Martin Luther was famous for nailing the 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg and contributed to the Protestant Reformation. But now Lutherans, like German Chancellor Angela Merkel, recognize his papal supremacy. The Lutheran, who is the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, recognizes papal supremacy also. And all over the world, Lutherans are reconciling with Rome. England separated from Rome in 1534. In the 19th century, John A. Kensett, who founded the Protestant Truth Society in 1889, and Walter Walsh, who was a famous Protestant author, warned of the Romanizing of the Anglican Church. But now the head of the Anglican Church, Justin Welby, with his fish mitre and serpent crozier, looks no different to the current Pope, who is adorned in the same attire. And the Anglican Church has now fully reconciled with Rome. But Rome's number one prize is to control the most powerful nation on earth, the United States. Protestant North America has always been weary of the inroads of Romanism. Strong warnings came from men such as Presbyterian preacher Lyman Beecher, American inventor and Calvinist Samuel Morse, who invented the Morse code, and Charles Chiniquy, the former Catholic priest turned Protestant convert. He documented in his book 50 Years in the Church of Rome that Abraham Lincoln's assassination was carried out by the Jesuits. Is that a conspiracy theory? The home where the conspirators all dwelt was the home of Roman Catholic Mary Surratt. When she was executed on the scaffold, the two men beside her were Jacob Ambrose Walter, her personal confessor and priest, and Jesuit priest Bernardine F. Wiggett. Her son, John Surratt, who was wanted for the murder, fled into Canada, crossed into Europe, and guess where he was discovered? Among the papal guards of Pope Pius IX in Rome. Why would a wanted criminal get asylum among the Pope's guards? That is very strange. Was the famous Pio Nino aware of the assassination? And what about Samuel Mudd, the Catholic Georgetown educated doctor? He treated the wounds of Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. There is a reason why many men were cautious and aware of the Catholic takeover. John Hughes, the Irish-American Archbishop of New York, made a statement that made it quite clear what the papacy's plans were. John Hughes in 1850, amid a flurry of Protestant worries about Catholic proselytizing, he told them that they had good cause to worry. Roman Catholicism, he said, will convert all pagan nations, even England with her proud parliament. Everybody should know that we have for our mission to convert the world, including the inhabitants of the United States, the people of the cities and the people of the country, the officers of the Navy and the Marines, commander of the army, the legislators, the Senate, the cabinet, the president, and all. But now the Protestant guard is put down, and thanks to ecumenism, the churches have now reconciled with Rome. And the churches are slowly being trained to be government entities that will reconcile them via the influential leaders back to Rome. But there will be a struggle.
Lord, we need an army of believers, and we'll stand on your word above all else.
I would rather stand with God and be judged by the world than stand with the world and be judged by God. I am not going to be afraid to say the name Jesus.
The churches of North America, who have always been more privileged than any institution, are beginning to feel the strain of secularization, and the privileges it once had are gradually being pulled. But any Christian who has any awareness of where we are in prophetic time knows that if you can't stand on your own for Jesus Christ now, then you won't stand for him when the final test comes. To keep a check on all the churches and to see that they all come in line, George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, with a stroke of a pen, signed into law Executive Order 13397 on March 7, 2006, that now makes churches and faith-based communities government agencies under Homeland Security and FEMA, severing the separation of church and state and allowing the government to train churches on how to respond in a crisis and to become spying agencies for the state and to introduce a sort of governmental style of ecumenism. Just read the print for yourselves. But in order for this to become a fully effective tool, the churches have to deal with an issue they are the center of: racial division. The churches are at the center of racial discord in North America. And guess what? They prefer it that way. What a lovely reflection on the character of God. Pew Research surveyed and saw that mainstream churches are either exclusively black or exclusively white. The Huffington Post also did some research and found that in one national study of dating practices, researchers found those who attended church most often were far less likely to have dated someone from another race, and that churches are still one of the least likely places white, black, Asian, and Hispanic Americans will encounter one another. How embarrassing. It is during the US presidential elections where these divisions are clearly seen, where people's true loyalties lie. Rolling Stone did an article on billionaire Donald Trump and found that Trump's entire campaign has been predicated on one racist statement on another. But that has not stopped the white evangelicals from supporting him, even though his track record is totally contrary to the gospel. In early January 2016, NBC News reported that Trump has the highest support among white evangelical voters, 33%. Although Ben Carson did fairly well among white evangelicals, 12%, the group heavily favored Trump. Racial divisions will never die. But don't think that African Americans are exempt, not at all. When Barack Hussein Obama was elected as the 44th president of the United States for 2 terms, who do you think the black churches fully supported? The Pew Research Center did a survey and found that in 2008, 94% of the black Protestant churches voted for Obama, and in 2012, 95% voted for him. So the racial divide is clear, and the churches have made it clear that they have no interest in changing the status quo. But is there a danger when churches get too embroiled in politics and money? President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced the Johnson Amendment in 1954. It wasn't originally intended for the churches, but 501c3 was introduced, and if you carefully read the print, it says that churches and religious organizations, to qualify for tax-exempt status, the organization must meet the following requirements. The organization may not interfere in political campaigns. So if a church is under a charitable tax-exempt status, her mouth is under a muzzle. But the First Amendment of the Constitution says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or, and listen carefully, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. How will the churches get around it? Well, they are adamant that despite 501c3, they are still going to get involved in politics, naively believing that it's going to change the moral fabric of America. But they don't seem to see that their own Protestant and evangelical churches are declining, and the decline is growing each day. And even though there are mega churches, even they are declining in attendance, for people are looking for something a bit deeper, and the scandals in the pulpit and the pew are rocking the church, where the government has been observing these profit-making ministries and have been appalled that men and women are fleecing gazillions from their naive and gullible congregations and are living extreme and lavish lifestyles as multi-millionaires. But all roads will lead to Rome, and these celebrity preachers are steering the faithful into the hands of the papacy, putting people's guards down.
But we've just got one more question coming through. Boring File Clerk says, what's your view of the current Pope? You know, the Pope has obviously been reaching out and has been a force of moderation in comparison to his predecessors. What do you make of it?
I think the Pope is fantastic. You know, I just think his tone, his humility, his, you know, I loved when he said the other day, you know, and it's our view too. We're not trying to, you know, make this a little bitty narrow thing. Anybody's welcome. We may not agree, you know, 100% on doctrine and theology, but you know what? The church, Catholic Church, our church, it's open for everybody. So I like his tone, not pushing people away, but I believe God's big and his mercy is very wide.
So this is the new face of Christianity, where piety trumps doctrine. In other words, no more thus saith the Lord. Let's just let bygones be bygones. And the biggest evangelical names in Protestant North America are uniting with a power that still views her as heretics. But the papacy also has her agenda for the world.
La mayor parte de los habitantes del planeta se declaran creyentes. Esto debería provocar un diálogo entre las religiones. No debemos dejar de orar por él y colaborar con quienes piensan distinto.
Confío en Buda.
Creo en Dios.
Creo en Jesucristo.
Creo en Dios, Alá.
Muchos piensan distinto, sienten distinto, buscan a Dios o encuentran a Dios de diversa manera. En esta multitud, en este abanico de religiones, hay una sola certeza que tenemos para todos. Todos somos hijos de Dios.
Creo en el amor.
Creo en el amor.
Creo en el amor.
Creo en el amor.
Confío en vos para difundir mi petición de este mes. Que el diálogo sincero entre hombres y mujeres de diversas religiones conlleve frutos de paz y justicia. Confío en tu oración.
Under the guise of protecting innocents who are illegally trafficked, where the papacy is working with the law enforcement agencies around the world, that includes Theresa May, the current British Home Secretary, and the UK's Metropolitan Police Force, so Rome could get intel on the internal policies of the UK. It also works with Europol, the law enforcement agency of the European Union, and Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, and the United Nations, where it has cleverly capitalized on the environmental movement, where very few are aware that this is just one of the clever smokescreens for world government, where world leaders and highly influential celebrities will be pushing for this papal agenda, not being aware of who they are actually working for to prepare the world to become a global citizen, where people will give up their individual rights to become a member of the New World Order family. And how will the papacy ever so intelligently condition the secular mind to embrace her global supremacy?
Of all the theories proposed by astronomers to try and explain the observed features of our universe, none has captured the imagination more than the Big Bang. This model has transformed our understanding of the cosmos and the origins of space and time. And the father of the Big Bang was the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre, and subsequently trained as both a priest and a physicist. It was Lemaitre's creative genius and vision that rewrote our understanding of the universe in a single theory that could explain phenomena observed beyond our own Milky Way.
The ideas of Georges Lemaitre, this Belgian Catholic priest scientist, as mentioned in the previous study, is the reason why people all over the planet believe in the Big Bang, and I stress theory, that he titled the hypothesis of the primeval atom, where God is totally removed out of the minds as being the creator of the universe. Same old lie at Eden, even though cosmologists are beginning to question its authenticity, but the damage has still been done. The 19th century English naturalist and geologist Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. He is still praised by the most respected naturalist scientists in the world. But, like the Big Bang, the fossil evidence is proving that it is totally false. But the Vatican hosted a conference in 2009 to praise the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of Species. The Vatican has tried to merge the world and the church, but the two just don't mix. But the secular world still works with the Vatican to remove God. And the Vatican is mixing with the top scientists on earth whose scientific positions will influence the world. And Pope Francis' scientific speculations from his science committee that includes Verodram Ramathan and the man who influenced his encyclical, Professor Jan Schalnuber. Darwin's theory has greatly influenced the Vatican, where in 1996, nearly a century and a half after Darwin's Origin of Species, Pope John Paul II has put the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church firmly behind the view that the human body may not have been the immediate creation of God, but is the product of a gradual process of evolution. Pope Benedict XVI, 11 years later, endorsed his predecessor, and the current Pope, Francis I, also gave his endorsement of both evolution and the Big Bang. And this should give people a picture of what the papacy is really about, and it is not about God's business. Carl Sagan, the late US astronomer and cosmologist, tried to disprove creation. And he said that the cosmos is within us. Sounds very New Age. But we are all created from the dust of the earth, which is from the same materials that makes up the universe. But a medal has been awarded in his honor that is given to an individual each year. And one of the names in 2014 was Consul Magno. And Brother Guy Consul Magno, this American Jesuit priest, was awarded this medal, becoming the first clergyman to do so. And though Carl Sagan was solely against God, this is of no interest to the papacy and to the Jesuit who has been recently selected to head the Vatican Observatory. If the papacy aligns itself with modern secular science, this will make the world put down her guard and become a lot more sympathetic to her. And in 1851, J.A. Wiley said, moreover, though skepticism has set free the masses from the papacy in the first place, it may in its ulterior effects contribute to their return. The world is definitely becoming more sympathetic to Papal Rome. But how can you possibly train the world to have a pre-Reformation mindset and teach them, as Satan taught Eve, to trust in their own hearts and to reject the word of God? Well, let's see.
Trust in me. The Force, it's calling to you. Just let it in.
We, as a population on this planet, have been looking for a savior.
If man won't kill God, the devil will do it.
The world needs the X-Men.
That's why I'm here.
I've been called many things over many lifetimes. Ra, Krishna, Yahweh.
Ever since the world found out about mutants, there have been secret societies who see them as some kind of second coming or sign of God. Wherever this being was, he always had 4 followers he would imbue with power.
Like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You got that one from the Bible.
Or the Bible got it from him.
Too highly grown to go Hollywood. What's in your pockets? What's in your pocketbook? We think the Bible's a comic book.
Entertainment has been so cleverly used to shape people's world view. And if the papacy is to ever restore her former glory, it will be absolutely impossible without the military might of the United States, the only world power capable of restoring papal supremacy. So let us take a look at how America will use her military to control the globe. If you ever want to know how the world functions, you need to study economics. Once that is under your belt, you will clearly understand everything. Is Islam a threat, or is she being used for financial corporate self-interest? There are many who see Islam as a threat, but most so-called terrorists or freedom fighters are trained and bankrolled by the West. The CIA has shaped that region very covertly. She works with NATO member Turkey, trained rebels to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, and evidence is being unearthed that she still colludes with terror groups in Libya to this very day, and has attempted to use Hollywood to downplay her dirty dealings. They are the masterminds of torture in Guantanamo Bay, and work with the Palestinian authorities to torture members of Hamas. They work with Mossad in Tunisia, are causing havoc in Algeria. They work with the head of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, where it has been revealed that the uprisings against both Morsi and Mubarak were fully orchestrated by the United States. They work with Qatar, as well as rebels in Syria, which they are apparently fighting against. They are even working with Lebanon's Hezbollah, and they have been working with Pakistani intelligence from the 1980s to this very day. They work with the Saudi government to fly drones on enemy targets, and the last king of Jordan and his son and successor have been on the CIA payroll, as well as top men in the government of Afghanistan. Why is there an interest in Afghanistan? In 2008, a film was released called Iron Man. To your average person, it was just a piece of entertainment. But was it? The trailer starts off in Afghanistan, and the film was a subtle, or you could say overt, endorsement of the war in Afghanistan. Why did America fly all the way across the world to start a war in another man's country? Was it really because some men crashed 2 planes in New York? The United States set up the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, and they're not leaving at all. Why? Mercenaries have profited from the war, where the region known as the Golden Crescent is the largest producer of opium on the planet from the poppy fields. But Afghanistan also has $1 to $3 trillion worth of minerals, and the US is getting her slice of the pie, but that is not the real reason why she is there. The BBC in 2001 was very clear that it was a pipeline war. Oil. Not about Taliban or Al-Qaeda Islamic extremists, but about economics and energy. This was also verified by the London Guardian, where it said that Afghanistan is as indispensable to the regional and transportation of oil in Asia. The 2014 film American Sniper was also a justification of the United States' second major 21st century war, the war in Iraq. Declassified documents from the CIA show that Saddam was a CIA ally, where they helped him with the supply of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war in the early 1980s. And guess who was his #1 supporter? A man who has been in many US administrations, Donald Rumsfeld. It was during the Reagan administration that Rumsfeld gave Saddam all his support. And if you want to title the late Saddam as a dictator, he was one with US support. But the pendulum started to swing the other way, and an ally now turned into an enemy. Why? The National Energy Policy was a document that was published in May 2001 by the Council on Foreign Relations and the James Baker Institute for Public Policy, 4 months before 9/11. When reading through its 107 pages, you get a clear picture of one of the aims of the war on terror. It says that the United States consumes over 25% of the oil produced worldwide. That is 1/4. And it is clear that American foreign policy depends upon the energy alliances of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Algeria, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. No mention of Iraq. It continues to say that by any estimation, Middle East oil producers will remain central to, now please listen very carefully, world oil security. This chart on the right shows that 67%, that is almost 3/4 of the planet's oil supply, is in the Middle East. Thus, listen very carefully, the global economy will almost certainly continue to depend upon the supply of oil from Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, members particularly in the Gulf. This region will remain vital to US interests. This document that is freely accessible and is open to the public online should open your eyes and give you a clear picture of the global war on terror. It is over energy and economics. And when Saddam switched from dollars to euros on the oil market, his goose was cooked. On the front cover of the London Daily Mirror newspaper on the year of the invasion in 2003, it clearly told us what the war was about: oil. And it wasn't about weapons of mass destruction. It reads, "I shall not exonerate Saddam Hussein from blame. I will mobilize our troops and jets to Kuwait and the Persian Gulf. I will be prepared for total war. The message is, I'm coming to kick your bleep, Saddam." The Western media is now openly telling us what the war was all about. And oil companies that were once barred under Saddam's rule have now begun a corporate takeover of the southern oil fields. It was all about energy. The 2012 anti-Iranian CIA propaganda flick, Argo, was one of many films that were building up and psyching up the world with a showdown with Iran. Iran has always been presented as this anti-liberal, Islamic terrorist Shiite-backed regime. But with negotiations throughout 2015, it is becoming ever more clearer that it is all about the oil and Iran's gas, as well as the US-backed Saudi regime's war in Yemen. It's about the oil. President Assad is under pressure from the Western governments, but he is not innocent and squeaky clean. Documents have been unearthed that he assisted the United States in the rendition program where Muslims were tortured in Syria on behalf of the CIA. But now he is an enemy. Do you want to know why? In 2011, Syria, Iraq, and Iran signed a $10 billion gas pipeline deal. And like Saddam, when your interests come into conflict with the energy interests of the West, you are now a terrorist. And that is why the West has allowed ISIS to run havoc in both Iraq and Syria, where Muslims are just killing Muslims and Christians. But they don't touch the Iraqi oil fields and the Jewish state of Israel. Doctors Without Borders tells of the havoc civilians have to face on a day-to-day basis. And those of us who live outside of that region, though we may have our own individual problems and daily struggles, it is nothing in comparison to people who are daily losing children, neighbors, uncles, aunts, and parents. And for those who have this naive belief that war doesn't affect us, well, that's what you think. London's Daily Express, dated to Wednesday, December 16, 2015, says how the oil crisis has greatly affected investments and people's pensions. And those looking to get a pension at retirement age, well, your chances are looking quite bleak. The damage of these energy wars has greatly affected the whole world. And no matter what continent you visit, their governments have a volume of terror laws turning each country all around the world into surveillance states. And for those who know where all this is leading to, it is laying the groundwork for the most challenging period of prophetic history, the mark, the image, and the number of the beast. The late Avro Manhattan, one of the best and most respected journalists of the 20th century, observed that the more US corporations expanded their empires, then the more of civil and religious liberties will be threatened. He said that big business is the promoter of practically all subsequent North American aggressions. It is the most persistent destroyers of the civil liberties of the American masses. His words were verified by Hollywood in 1976.
It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
But how did these huge corporations that have a monopoly over the earth get started? How were clothing lines and textile companies in North America able to get a head start in life? How were newspaper companies in North America able to expand and influence the thinking of the whole nation? And when did insurance companies spring from? And why is there so much controversy over their beginnings? Many will try to gloss over history, but you cannot study micro or macroeconomics and how the Western world transformed from an agricultural society to an industrial society, and how banks in their embryonic stages in the Middle Ages, starting with the rich cities of Renaissance Italy and spreading throughout wealthy dynastic families in Europe, became these huge credit lending monopolies who have complete control over the financial market without studying a still very contentious area of European history. How did modern banking start? And what influence will these financial entities have on the closing stages of world history? Let us see.
And that servant that don't obey his Lord shall be beaten with many stripes. That's scripture.
The condition of your laborers, it's all wrong.
They're my property.
You say that with pride.
I say it as fact.
There are many who still believe that the transatlantic slave trade was a product of religion and pseudo-scientific racism. That is totally false. Science and religion were both misused to justify brutality. But slavery, from the beginning to the end, was all about economics. This is well documented in the scholarly book Capitalism and Slavery by the late West Indian historian and Trinidadian Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams. Blacks were not kidnapped and hauled into ships to become a member of Christ's eternal kingdom, but was to be treated as property and forced chattel so that men could run a successful business and boost the economic revenues of the quarreling and warring factions of the expanding empires within the European continent. It was slavery that built the world economy and led to what today is modern capitalism. And the United Nations declares that the transatlantic slave trade is often regarded as the first system of globalization, where the trading between Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas integrated a global economy. Even though some have tried to downplay it, this is what led to the economic development of the United States, and this will be shown more in a while. But it is fair to look at history from different angles. Many greedy black Africans were already trading their own people with the Arabs. When the Europeans came, they continued the cycle, not actually realizing its future repercussions and its finance in the global economic enterprise of the European races. This is not to say that there wasn't resistance. This picture is from the UNESCO series on women in African history of Queen Anne Zinga, who ruled Western Sudan, which is modern-day Angola. She put up a strong resistance against the Portuguese. In Latin America, slaves in Ecuador fled into the jungle and set up their own communities with a mixture of Spanish, Indian, and African cultures. In Mexico, Gaspar Yunga led a slave uprising, and his resistance with his Maroons led to an agreement with the Spanish colonial government to have their own land. In Jamaica, the Maroons were just as ferocious as the ones in Mexico. Some of its heroes are Nanny the Maroon, a ferocious fighter, and another one called Three-Fingered Jack. The Maroons burnt down plantations, sometimes even fighting themselves, and it cost the English £250,000, and the English were forced to make a truce with Colonel Cudjoe on the right, the chief of the Maroons, where he exchanges hats with Colonel Guthrie of England on the left. And from the 1739 treaty with the British to this very day, the Maroons still have their own settlement and 1,500 acres of land, and that island still has its original name given to it by the natives, Jamaica, or Jamaica, the land of wood and water. The Dutch also played a heavy role in slavery, sending delegates to the Congo, first to establish international relations. Don Miguel de Castro, adorned in either Portuguese or Dutch attire, was a 17th century nobleman and Congo emissary. He was sent by the ruler of Sonho, a province of Congo, via northern Brazil, at the time a Dutch province, to the Netherlands, with his two servants, Pedro Sunda and Diego Bemba, where they are holding the two main sources of wealth in West Africa, an ivory tusk and a jewel box. The jewel box may have had gold, which was one of the top main items that was used for both trading and ornamentation within some of the cultures of West Africa. The paintings of the Dutch Golden Age in Holland shows the Dutch in Europe, mostly nobility, with their black servants. At that time, it was the high fashion throughout Europe in that day to be in a painting with a black servant. But in the Dutch province of northern Brazil, blacks were slaves, many of them dressed in the weaponry of the Akan warriors of West Africa. And in the Dutch colonies, these slaves were also going to revolt. In the north of Brazil, in Dutch-controlled Guyana, the Berbice slave uprising that lasted from 1763 to 1764 was an anti-colonial struggle, where the slaves rose up, took over the plantations, and controlled the south, and the Dutch slaveholders had to flee to the north. This uprising was led by Kofi, an Akan warrior, and the Dutch only defeated them when they got assistance from French and British troops. In Dutch Suriname in the Caribbean, the slaves also rose up to revolt, and like the Maroons in Jamaica, the Dutch were forced to sign a treaty with them and give them their own land. Another revolt in 1795 in Curaçao, one of the ABC Dutch-controlled islands in the southern Caribbean Sea, was led by a slave named Tula. The reason these slaves revolted because they heard of another slave revolt in the Caribbean, one that has been very downplayed by Western historians despite it being described as one of the defining moments in the history of the Atlantic world that influenced the economy of the world commodity markets. The London Guardian records how Toussaint Louverture defeated Britain, France, and Spain to create a country free from slavery. And this black Haitian revolutionary leader nicknamed the Black Napoleon, led a serious revolt against the European nations that weakened their, now listen very carefully, economic control. And the Haitian Revolution created the first Black Republic, where, like Jamaica, it has kept the name given to it by the natives, Haiti. And this revolution economically messed up France, where Napoleon Bonaparte in 1803 had to sell his territories west of the Mississippi River, notably Louisiana, that is 827,000 square miles of land, for $15 million. It is known as the famous Louisiana Purchase, to the then growing United States, an economic boost for that growing nation. The United States has attracted people from all over the world, where it is the most financially prosperous nation on earth. Its unchallenged history has always been told from a perspective of a nation that was built by hard-working, law-abiding, God-fearing citizens. That is partly true. But how did it become a nation to produce the first set of billionaires? How did the billionaire Anglican Henry Ford get the opportunity to manufacture the first automobile? How did billionaire Thomas Edison get the opportunity to electrify the entire world? How did the billionaire Presbyterian Andrew Carnegie help build the American steel industry? And how did the billionaire Northern Baptist John D. Rockefeller Sr. manage to become the richest man in US history and revolutionize the petroleum industry? John D. Rockefeller Sr. had a complete monopoly on the US oil industry through his clever business skills and his bullying tactics. But it was the railroads that allowed his oil business to effectively transport black gold throughout the United States. But how did these rail networks develop? William Aiken Jr. was a South Carolina congressman and governor. He owned 878 slaves, making him the third largest slaveholder in South Carolina, with the largest rice plantation in the state, 1,500 acres, where he made a fortune from rice, cotton, and sweet potato, and the investment and stocks from private railroad companies he inherited from his father. The United States has the world's longest railway network, operating a route length of over 250,000 kilometers. Its freight line constitutes about 80% of the country's rail network, but evidence has shown that this network was built upon slavery. The U.S. Capitol building, where the Senate and the House of Representatives come together, is built on 19th century neoclassical architecture. The White House, the home of successive U.S. presidents, is also designed in neoclassical architecture, but they were both built on black slave labor, where construction was totally dependent upon slaves, and they have erected a memorial in commemoration of the slaves who built these two remarkable monuments. The first U.S. presidents themselves, such as George Washington, the first president of the United States and founding father, had hundreds of slaves, and he had no desire of releasing them until after he died, as stated in his will. Benjamin Franklin, another founding father, was a brilliant inventor, but he also owned slaves, and he had conflicting and contradictory views on race. Thomas Jefferson, another founding father and the third president of the United States, was also a slave owner. He owned 600 slaves over his lifetime. His most famous slave was Isaac Jefferson, who survived him by 24 years. The founding fathers compiled a most beautiful document to protect future generations, and it is under siege. But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, is a document the founding fathers had a struggle coping with. What about the academic institutions in North America? How were they developed? This grave in Wales reads, "Born in America, in Europe bred, in Africa travelled, and in Asia wed. It belongs to Elihu Yale, who was born in Boston, America, but retired in England but lived in India. He worked as an official of the British East India Company and has been titled as one of the world's first super managers. This extremely wealthy merchant, as seen in the center, has a black servant on the right. He was encouraged by the Harvard graduate Reverend Cotton Mather, who also owned slaves, to donate some of his large book collection to Collegiate School in Connecticut, where it was renamed after him, called Yale. George Berkeley, an Anglo-Irish Anglican bishop, bought a plantation and gave a gift of 4 slaves to Yale. When he returned to England, he donated the plantation to Yale. Congregationalist minister Ezra Stiles, who was the 7th president of Yale, also owned a slave, and today Yale is struggling with its past connections to slavery. Students at Harvard University got access to its archives and discovered that it was the first institution of higher learning in colonial America to train ministers. But some of its ministers, former student and 7th president Puritan Increase Mather, had his own personal African slave called Spaniard. Isaac Royal Jr. was born in Antigua in the Caribbean, where he moved to Massachusetts in the United States, and he was eventually banished to England. He financed the oldest and most distinguished American legal education, Harvard's Royal Professor of Law, and on their official website, the second paragraph declares that he was a wealthy Antiguan plantation owner and a slave holder. And students want his name removed. That is going to create more tension. Eleazar Wheelock was an American Congregationalist minister who founded and became the first president of Dartmouth College. His campus also had Negro slaves, where he had many of his own. Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist Calvinist preacher and theologian, famous for the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He was the 3rd president of Princeton, an institution financed and founded by Presbyterians to train ministers. And though he preached a sermon condemning slavery, he also had his own slave. There are many who may be shocked to see that the economic foundations of all these prestigious institutions of North America was founded on slavery. It may provoke and agitate emotions of people of both African and European descent. But people have to realize that in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, this was the norm. It was normal to have slaves, and to speak out against it back then, you would have been ridiculed. The economic revenues of the plantations financed these institutions and changed the entire world. Coffee beans, when brewed, is turned into a beverage. But how did that develop? Brazil was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery, and for the past 150 years, it has been the world's largest producer of coffee. But this started off the backs of black slaves. But coffee needs sugar to give it that flavor, and that craving grew rapidly in Europe, where the Captain General and Commander-in-Chief of the Leeward Islands, Christopher Codrington, the Barbadian-born, Oxford-educated British soldier, plantation and slave owner, made huge profits from the sugar on his plantations, which the British colonists called white gold, where, as a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford, used his huge wealth and fortune to pay for the Codrington Library at All Souls College, a monument to the power of slavery, where he bequeathed in his will £10,000 and 12,000 volumes of books, showing how slavery even shaped Oxford University. And even after slavery was abolished in the British colonies in 1833, blacks were still growing sugarcane for the plantation owners from the plant introduced into the Caribbean from Southeast Asia by Christopher Columbus. And the cotton boom that changed the landscape of the American economy, where the Industrial Revolution made cotton the world's most traded commodity, was developed on slave labor. And just like the children of Uzbekistan today, who work under horrific conditions to produce cotton for our modern day consumerism. This photo, dated to 1908 on a plantation in Mississippi, 43 years after slavery was abolished in North America, like the West Indian planters, was still keeping the American economy going, and is what led to modern capitalism in the West. But when did this traffic begin? All roads will begin and end in Rome, as we shall see throughout this study. And Pope Nicholas V introduced 2 papal bulls that introduced slavery. And the Spanish Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas recommended that Africans should be enslaved to protect the natives, where it was authorized by King Charles V of the Holy Roman Habsburg Empire in 1517, the same year Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses. The Spanish Grand Inquisitor, Cardinal and statesman Francisco Cisneros, regent of Spain, oversaw the requests of enforcing blacks, then called Negroes, into Hispaniola, today's Haiti and Dominican Republic, where the Spanish dominated for a while this economic enterprise. Many may ask the question, why were blacks used to boost the economic outgrowth of the European culture? What was it about their physique and physical appearance that made them a prime target? And why didn't the Europeans just do it themselves or use the natives of the Caribbean? Antonio de Herrera Tordesillas was a Spanish chronicler, historian, and writer of the Spanish Golden Age. And in his account of Spain and the Americas, he said that as the monks of the Dominican order continued to emphasize the necessity of relieving the condition of the Indians, it was ordered that since the labor of one Negro was more valuable than that of 4 Indians, every effort should be made to bring to Hispaniola many Negroes from Guinea. This is why blacks became the chief choice for slavery. But the balance of power started to shift from Spanish control, and a new power began to dominate the waves that would challenge Spain's supremacy. The current British Prime Minister, David Cameron, is a millionaire and a descendant of the English slaveholding families who received reparation payments when slavery was abolished. When England separated itself from Papal Rome in the 16th century Protestant Reformation, it fully released itself from the feudalistic serfdom system, and under English common law, it was illegal for anyone to be a slave on English soil. So Admiral Sir John Hawkins, an English naval commander, like the Spanish, went to Guinea and became the first English slave trader in African slaves. His cousin, Sea Captain Sir Francis Drake, assisted him and discovered tobacco in the Americas. In the English colony of Jamestown in Virginia, slave labor was used to grow the tobacco plant. Tobacco made planters in the Americas, merchants in England, and ship owners who connected them all and became immensely rich, where it drove much of the economy of the North Atlantic world, where the lives of Scots and English merchants, Chesapeake planters, and an international host of sailors connected them all, and the profits of the tobacco that was shipped to England kept these colonies alive, where dynasties like the Calverts not only had slave labor to run their colony and tobacco business, but they were granted a land called Maryland in 1634 by the English Stuart monarch King Charles I before he was beheaded. This monarch just prior, on July 2nd, 1627, granted the islands of the Caribbees to James Hay, the first Earl of Carlisle, where he was given Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Barbados, Nevis, Anguilla, St. Martin, and other islands as a monopoly to manage, where the slave trade contributed to the growth of both the Royal Navy and the United Kingdom's Merchant Navy, and it gave jobs to seamen, auxiliary traders, carpenters, painters, boat builders, tradesmen, insurance companies that led to the growth of London and the seaports of Bristol, Liverpool and Glasgow that later gave growth to industry in the towns of Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield. But the money had to be stored in banks, and the Bank of England, once nicknamed the Bank of the West Indies, was developed as well as other banks. Lloyds Bank is a British and commercial bank. It was founded by a Quaker, Birmingham banker Sampson Lloyd II, and the official website confirms that he co-founded it with the Unitarian John Taylor. Descendants of slaves want compensation for what their forefathers suffered from the bank and from the Lloyds Insurance Company. Barclays is a British multinational bank. It was founded by David Barclay, who was a merchant and banker and one of the 84 Quaker slave traders in 1756. Barclays also admits its role in slavery. Sir Francis Baring, a merchant and banker who created Baring's Banks from another Quaker family, was also founded on slavery. Sir Richard Neave, who was the director of the Bank of England for 48 years, also profited from slavery. And the Financial Times documents that the Rothschilds in London under Nathan Rothschild profited from slavery. And that is why both New York and London are considered as the financial centers of the world, for they both developed as a result of slavery. When many see Wall Street, they are unaware of its beginnings and how it is envied by the world as a financial hub. Many in North America criticize the preservation of Confederate flags and see it as a badge or symbol of secessionist racism. But Northerners are oblivious to their own history. New York City was founded on slavery that led to the development of Wall Street. It was the Dutch who started slavery in New York, which was then called New Amsterdam. And when the English took over it, it was changed to New York, where Philip Livingston, who was a statesman, merchant and slave trader, was able to develop his business and trade. Banker Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the Second Bank of the United States, funded banks in Mississippi to promote the expansion of plantation lands. John Brown I was a merchant, slave trader and statesman from Rhode Island who used his slave money to finance and set up Brown University in Rhode Island, founded in 1764, where a steering committee in 2003 were researching its early connections to slavery. He also founded Providence Bank, later to be called Fleet Boston Financial Group, where the USA Today confirms that he was a slave trader, where in the pre-Civil War cotton trade, its key financiers included Britain's Barings Brothers, the Anglo-French Rothschild firm, and Baltimore-based Alex Brown and Sons. In 2004, Fleet Boston merged with the Bank of America. The Waldorf Astoria in New York was completed in 1839. It is named after the prominent German-American business family, the Astor family. Businessman John Jacob Astor emigrated from Germany to New York, and this merchant, fur trader, and investor became the first multi-millionaire in the United States from slavery. His protege, Moses Taylor, a New York merchant and banker, was a sugar and slave trader who founded the National City Bank of New York, the third largest bank holding company of the US by its assets, that is now called Citigroup. The Brown Brothers was founded on slavery, and the Lehman Brothers was also founded on slavery. Jacob Schiff, a German Jewish immigrant to New York, joined and headed the firm Kuhn Loeb & Co., where he financed wars, and his rival was Episcopalian John Piermont Morgan, a banker whose financial monopoly influenced the development of industry in the United States. It is becoming ever more clearer that as people are now getting access to the historical documents of these financial institutions, the big banks of the United States, Bank of America, JP Morgan and Chase, and Citigroup, who are now apologizing for their dark past, we now know that they were founded and profited from slavery. And it is impossible to see how the global financial system of today works and how it operates without seeing how it was built up and developed in the first place. And there are many who are observing that it is the bankers, those who control the money, who makes the rules.
If there was one physical subject, one material subject that we should focus on, in my opinion, it is very clear that the head of the snake is the financial system. We can argue till the end of time about who runs the world. Is it the Jesuits? Is it the reptilians? Is it the Illuminati? Is it the Freemasons? We can go on and on and on and on about this. But I don't think it is reasonable to even begin arguing about the mechanism that is used to exert this control. The mechanism is finance. The whole point of finance is to indebt, otherwise to enslave. What is a mortgage? I mean, what does that stand for? It's a death grip.
He does have a valid argument that is almost impossible to refute. So let's look at the bankers, beginning with Goldman Sachs.
Venerable and famous institution. Goldman's alumni are around the world running financial institutions, but also treasuries, central banks, everything else. What's the secret of Goldman Sachs?
The new Prime Minister of Australia.
Prime Minister. I was going to ask you about Malcolm Turnbull. It's you have. What's Goldman's secret? I mean, how does this institution manage to be such an extraordinarily dominant financial institution, but also attracts these extraordinarily talented people who go on to do remarkable things? What is it?
So exactly how powerful is Goldman Sachs? According to the London Independent, their influence covers the whole world. Former employees have exposed how corrupt it is. It is under investigation by the FBI. A New York Times journalist investigated how it finances the sex trafficking industry. Its meddling in world affairs could ignite an oil war in Kurdistan. It has a heavy role in the Greek debt crisis, where one of the world's leading debtors, the IMF, refuses to bail out Greece. And many are realizing that when you control the money, then democracy is a joke. They were against Labour winning the UK elections in spring 2015. And they are tied in with the US government, where both Jeb Bush is financed by them to enter into the White House, where he already belongs to a well-to-do dynasty, and Hillary Clinton not only is financed by them, but pockets huge amounts from them and does not even hide her close links.
I'd like to welcome to the stage Lloyd Blankfein, Chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs.
Its former employees are in some of the highest positions in banking. Neil Kashkari is an American banker and politician and former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was appointed as the 13th and Chief Executive Officer of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, which will be starting from January 1st, 2016. According to Bloomberg, last week's appointment of Neil Kashkari to run the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis as of January means a third of the Fed's 12 district banks will soon be run by officials with past ties to Goldman Sachs Group Inc. Thomas K. Montag, Chief Operating Officer for the Bank of America, worked for Goldman Sachs as the co-head of the global securities business. Mark Carney is a Canadian central banker and the governor of the Bank of England, where the bank's official website says he worked for Goldman Sachs for 13 years in London, Tokyo, New York, and Toronto. Mario Draghi is an Italian banker and a product of Jesuit education. He is the current president of the European Central Bank, where its official website says he was the vice chairman and a managing director at Goldman Sachs International between 2002 and 2005. Austrian-born banker Dr. Paul H. Leichner is a member of the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group. He is the chairman of the supervisory board of Deutsche Bank, and it declares that he worked for Goldman Sachs from 1989 to 1999. But some of these men mentioned are a part of an exclusive club of bankers. 18 members who meet every other month on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. in Conference Room E in a circular tower block in Switzerland. It is called the Bank of International Settlements, and the only book that documents its rise and present state is The Tower of Basel by investigative journalist Adam Lieber. Its official website says it is the oldest international financial organization, founded in 1930, that has 60 member central banks as members, representing countries from around the world that makes up 95% of the world's gross domestic product. That's the world's wealth. The Encyclopedia Britannica confirmed this when it says that the Bank for International Settlements at Basel, Switzerland, was created to establish an institution for cooperation among the central banks of different countries. So they all work together. The central bank governors of Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, Canada, India, Brazil, the European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of China, and the US Federal Reserve. And this will be the last bank we will look at.
10 voting members on the US Federal Reserve Board have the power to influence the global economy. The question dominating the financial world, will they raise interest rates?
One of a president's most important appointments is chairman of the Federal Reserve. The Fed is the symbol of the integrity of our financial system, and the decisions of the Fed affects the lives and livelihoods of all Americans.
The Fed is a sometimes very independent organization.
Didn't the Federal Reserve System fail?
I know my time has run out, but I really fundamentally disagree with your point of view.
Who owns the Federal Reserve Bank, says its official website. It started with a very, very secretive meeting by some of the most influential men of the day, where no one in the public or no journalists were privy to what was going on. These top financiers were led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, head of the National Monetary Commission, and the delegation included Abraham Piatt Andrew Jr., an economist and an assistant secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of the National City Bank of New York, Henry Pomeroy Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles Dyer Norton, who was the president of Morgan-dominated First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong Jr., who was considered as a lieutenant of J.P. Morgan, and he was elected a president, then called governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the German-born American banker Paul M. Warburg from the Jewish banking dynasty, the Warburg family, who was the founder of the Federal Reserve System and became the first director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and chairman of the Bank of Manhattan and director of the Board of American I.G. Farben. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law in 1913, but not everybody was happy. Lewis Thomas McFadden was a banker, a Republican, and a member of the House of Representatives. He addressed Congress, and the U.S. poet Ezra Pound commissioned a man, the late Eustace Mullins, to write a book which has been titled The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, where it documented Louis McFadden's speech and the influence of the Federal Reserve has on manipulating the global market. It reads, on June 10, 1932, McFadden addressed the House of Representatives. He said, some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. The Federal Reserve banks are the agents of the foreign central banks. And this book documents what the Federal Reserve is capable of doing. The European central banks were planning the great contraction of credit which precipitated the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Considered the single most influential bank in the world, Sir Montagu Norman was organizer of informal talks between heads of central banks in 1927, which led directly to the great stock market crash of 1929. Lord Montagu Norman was governor of the Bank of England from 1916 to 1944. During this period, he participated in the central bank conferences which set up the crash of 1929 and a worldwide depression. After the agricultural depression of 1920 to 1921, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors settled down to 8 years of providing rapid credit expansion of the New York bankers, a policy which culminated in the Great Depression of 1929 to 31 and helped paralyze the economic structure of the world. The bankers wanted a depression because it put the business and finance of the United States in their hands. The Great Depression came about as a result of the financial crash of 1929. It was the bankers who gambled with the financial market and drew nearly the whole world into poverty except, guess who? China. As China was on a silver than a gold standard, it was hardly affected by the economic conditions of the worldwide depression. But other countries suffered hyperinflations and extensive banking and financial crises, and all the small banks were gobbled up and brought over where there was no competition. This photo shows from left to right German banker Hjalmar Schacht, who was the head of the Reichsbank, Benjamin Strong Jr. of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, and Charles Riss of the Bank of France in New York in 1927. All of these governors of these banks were the ones who caused the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve, from her own website, openly tells us that she bankrolled both the First and the Second World War, where she gave war loans. And just prior to and during the Second World Wars, the bankers whose countries were at war with each other were working together. Sir Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, considered as one of the most powerful men in the world, was one of the brains behind the Bank of International Settlements, as the Bank of England website confirms. This photo shows him with Hjalmar Schacht. What may be shocking to many is that Schacht was Hitler's personal banker and one of the financiers that bankrolled Hitler into office. And more light is coming out that the Bank of England helped the Nazis sell gold stolen from the Czechs. And it shows that the banks all work together, even if millions of innocent people are dying on the battlefield. The BBC website has confirmed that Chase Manhattan, JP Morgan, Guaranty Trust Co. of New York, Bank of the City of New York, and American Express seized Jewish bank accounts and gave them to the Nazis. And if our current world is totally in debt, and if the banks are the masterminds behind the 2008 recession, and all the intelligent newspapers are tracing it to the Federal Reserve, just as they stripped the Jews, you can only guess what this financial giant will do again. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Only the bankers have the power to do that. Can you imagine, just for argument's sake, what that time would be like? Your children run into the store, looking to buy something for themselves. They are overjoyed. They are over the moon, but you can't buy them a thing, because you have not given up your soul to the two kingdoms. That was just a scenario. It would be a lot worse than that. But for those who are carefully watching the pace of things, you can see how that system is gently being built up, slowly and gradually. And you will not be able to even have the most basic human right to eat or to drink. You will not be able to buy or sell. And this will be the true test of all who claim that they truly believe in God. This will be the time when you will know who you really are and who is really on the Lord's side. These terror laws and pro-gay laws are already making many prominent preachers numb with fear. And if you can't stand now, when there is peace and safety, you will not be able to stand when the final test comes. To have totally dependence upon God when all of your creature comforts are stripped from you will be the time when the foundations of your belief system will be shaken. And for those who spend hours on social media fighting each other about your denominational differences, and for all those who are caught up in the race issue, when that global decree is passed, your race is going to mean nothing. Your denominational title will be irrelevant. It will all be about you and God. As this study comes to a close, you should know that all roads lead to Rome. Pope Francis I heads the most powerful organization on earth, the papacy. While many see him as a pope, they seem to overlook that he's also a Jesuit. When you look up the word Jesuit in Old English dictionaries, it reads that a Jesuit is one of the order of the Society of Jesus, one of a religious order belonging to the Roman Catholic Church, founded by Ignatius Loyola in the 16th century. They are described as a crafty person, an intriguer, and the word Jesuitical means cunning and deceitful. This is how the dictionary describes the Jesuits: deceptive. This Jesuit Pope opens the great bronze doors of 16 panels at St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City to launch his Holy Year of Mercy. Passing through it is meant to symbolize the pilgrimage of life's journey and the sacrifices endured. But what is this Jubilee Year of Mercy? According to the USA Today, the Catholic Jubilee or Holy Year can be traced to Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 10 in the Bible, when all debt was lifted in the Old Testament among the children of Israel. And the Catholic Church says that all world debt should be lifted. But don't believe the hype. The Vatican Bank is fully in bed with these debtors, so it is just a smokescreen. And Peter Sutherland, a staunch Jesuit-educated Catholic, is one of her top financiers, a regular Bilderberg attendee who has worked for nearly every major world corporation. He has encouraged the undermining of the culture of the indigenous population of Europe, and he stepped down in May 2015 as the international chairman of guess who? Goldman Sachs. And when the money scandals rocked the Vatican, this overseer of Goldman Sachs bailed out Vatican Incorporated, where its CEO, Pope Francis I, appointed him as a financial advisor. On the official website of the Vatican Bank, known as the IOR, the Institute of Religious Works, It tries to be as transparent as possible as a result of outside pressure. And one of its staff, financial advisor Michael Hintz, also worked for, guess who? Goldman Sachs, which shows how heavily connected the Vatican is with Wall Street, where its riches are increasing 20-fold, though it is still seen as one of the key money laundering institutions on earth, constantly getting embroiled in scandal after scandal after its long history of mingling with, as Revelation chapter 18 words it, the merchants of the earth. Like the other banks, it also protected Nazi-plundered gold in its vaults, and Emil Alperin filed a lawsuit with other Jews to get back their stolen riches, but common sense will tell you that you will lose. But some light came out of that case. In one of the transcripts, it was disclosed that as one of the world's major banks, the Vatican Bank regularly receives by wire transfer the Sunday collections of 194 dioceses across the United States. It is connected by international routing number to all the major banks in the world. And being the richest organization on the planet, it also has the merchandise of gold, according to Revelation chapter 18 and verse 12. And guess where most of this gold is stored since the Second World War? Inside the Federal Reserve Bank. This is well documented by Avro Manhattan, where in his powerful research book called The Vatican Billions, he said that the Vatican's treasure of gold has been estimated by the United Nations World Magazine to amount to several $billion. A large bulk of this is stored in gold ingots with the US Federal Reserve Bank, while banks in England and Switzerland hold the rest. His words have been verified by this Jesuit priest who sits on the panel at a Council on Foreign Relations discussion. His name is Thomas J. Rees, and he wrote a book in the mid-1990s titled Inside the Vatican. And its title means what it says, where until the early 1990s, the Vatican held onto gold it had brought as the early 1930s. The gold was held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He continues how the financial world gives her advice for free. APSA has a committee of outside consultants that offer their services for free. Members have included the presidents of Merrill Lynch, Barclays Bank, Allied Signal, and others from Italian, French, and Swiss financial institutions and businesses. From this poster of Barclays Bank, you can see the Vatican in the background, for it is also clearly and closely tied with Barclays, where many of its past top bankers are from the church. John Varley, its former chief executive, and its former chairman, Marcus Aguirre, and they are deeply connected with the financial world, where this banker has married into the Rothschild banking dynasty, as confirmed by the Guardian newspaper. And David Yallop, considered as one of the greatest investigative journalists in the world, in his powerful book In God's Name, which was an expose of the death of Pope John Paul I, says that the tentacles of Vatican Incorporated spread worldwide. Close links were forged with an array of banks. Rothschilds of Paris and London had been doing business with the Vatican since the early 19th century. This is the extent of the papacy's influence within the financial world. It is well documented in Revelation chapter 18. And if you for one moment think that China is not under her radar, well, that's what you think. The London Times newspaper in 1951 documented how a plan was hatched to overthrow the Chinese government and it included a US colonel, David Barrett, and a Roman Catholic bishop. But she has changed her tactics, and she is now seeking diplomatic relations. And the papacy will establish relations with Chinese neighbors, such as Japan, where diplomacy started in 1942, where Ken Harada was the first Japanese diplomat to the papacy. Its representatives and popes have retained that relationship with Japanese heads of state, still retaining diplomacy with the US strongest ally in that region. But the Jesuits' slow and clever penetration into the Republic of China, better known as Taiwan, the only European state to recognize it, where it has established diplomatic relations with it, will eventually make China bend and give into the pressure of the First Kingdom, the papacy. So after this long thesis of even at the doors, do you really and truly believe that China will rise up and overtake the powers of the West and become the world's last superpower? Do you believe that she is going to unwind 2 millennia of Western domination of planet Earth? Or do you believe in the biblical prophetic charter that safely steers you on the right course? Most of the world will reject the Bible. We know that. But they still have to be told. Without Bible prophecy, there would be no knowledge of the 2 kingdoms. But these studies are to show that there is a God in heaven who still has a deep interest in his creation. And I pray you accept his free ticket into eternity. Feel free to subscribe to the Even at the Doors YouTube channel, where you'll receive regular videos. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links below. I would just like to thank all those who have sent donations that have kept this ministry afloat. And if you would like to continue to support this work, also click on the link below. If you would like to see this work spread even further, you have permission to distribute this video for non-commercial or commercial use on the condition that you do not add or take away from the content of this study. Thank you.